In fact, I remember talking to an advisor years ago, and they said, we'll look back like 50 years from now, it'd be less than that time, and think about how barbaric we were. How do you treat this ailment? Well, you blast the entire body with poison and hope some gets the tumors. No, not the way to go. So for whatever reason, we haven't really focused on this.
Hello, and welcome to Pharma Sessions, a place for pharmaceutical leaders to come and learn from each other. I'm your host, Jonathan Kaskey. Technology and market trends are bringing change at an ever-accelerating rate, and no person, team, or company can afford to be left behind. Here, we dive into the strategies and tactics that our guests use to tackle these challenges and create new opportunities, and how you can do the same in your own organization. This episode of Pharma Sessions is sponsored by Exunt, makers of the X1 reporting platform. On today's episode of Pharma Sessions, I'm thrilled to welcome Shaun Bagai, CEO of RenovoRx, a Nasdaq-listed oncology company pioneering targeted drug delivery through its trans-arterial microperfusion platform. So Shaun spent his career at the intersection of innovation and commercialization, from early-stage startups to large Medtech organizations like Medtronic and HeartFlow. And I think what makes this journey especially compelling is the path kind of turning down medical school, which we'll get into, turning to the world of building technologies that impact patients at scale, leading RenovoRx now for over a decade, from prototype stage to phase 3 trials, commercialization. So a lot of exciting stuff. We'll talk about entrepreneurship, disruptive oncology innovation, many other things. With that, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So before we get into the meat of it, I always like to start with a little icebreaker. And it's roughly morning time there on the West Coast. What have you had to eat so far today?
My breakfast of champions is actually a protein shake with an espresso shot. So that's what that's so far.
Right. And that's maximum efficiency of caffeine without even having to break pace. So I like it. All right. So tell the people a little bit about yourself. I know I'd alluded to it. You just kind of started this journey, maybe thinking you were going to be a doctor, but what's sort of your background and what the path that's led you to today?
Well, I appreciate the questions here, John. I've been passionate about business my whole life and medicine. I'd say as a child, when I just had a back injury playing football, and I got interested in medicine back then. And also, I've got a lot of doctors in the family on one side of the family, and a lot of business people on the other side of the family. So I think hopefully taking the best of both worlds, I've been able to have the lucky happenstance to drive medical technologies on a business standpoint that really has made a big impact on patients and medical care to date. And I feel like the biggest impact we could potentially have is here at RenovoRx.
You said you were interested in becoming a doctor, and you ended up not doing that. Was there a particular transition that made you make that decision, or a particular point that led you to that?
Absolutely. I'm very determined, and from a young age, I thought I'll be a physician and do everything you can to get there. So taking the MCATs, taking time off college sports, if you will, to study. And driving to the point I got accepted to med school and did a 1-year internship when I was applying between college, what would have been med school, at a medical device startup company. And the founder CEO actually had driven me to make a tough decision of maybe staying on the industry versus going on to med school. As much as he was an MD, he didn't practice medicine, and he built companies and has built several successful since, and really imparted on me as an entrepreneur. One could actually have a bigger impact on patients' lives by building and driving new therapies and technologies than a single physician possibly could. So it was a shift where I still get to do what I love doing on driving medical care in a sense of inventing or helping build new companies and technologies, yet I get the business aspect as well and the impact at the same time.
That's really interesting. So it's always funny to me how much happenstance kind of plays into this, where this is a fairly momentous, life trajectory type decision that you're making, but you're essentially presenting it as this was, you happen to get an internship with this person rather than, the company down the street, which might not have had nearly the same impact on your thoughts of medicine and how to impact patients.
Absolutely. It's interesting. So I feel like I've made several tough decisions along my career choices and school choices that would seem very counterintuitive to most people, but end up working out really well. So I've gotten lucky in a sense that these situations or happenstances have worked out. And even that CEO who told me that came by way of an internship I did in college at Stanford Animal Labs, doing medical research for a year, and happened to run across this company while doing my internship, and happened to meet the management there who said, "Hey, while you're waiting to get into med school, why don't you come work with us for a year?" So a lot of lucky pieces along the way, and as my stepmom likes to say, well, I put myself in front of good opportunities, and good things happen.
So, all right. So between that moment and spend a good chunk of time talking about your experience over the last 10 years at Renovo. But what was your experience in between those times, in between joining or starting Renovo and that moment that you're talking about?
So that first company is called Transvascular. I spent the first year on the preclinical research R&D side, helping drive the innovation aspect of the business, both from a very inexperienced entry-level position into running a lot of the R&D programs. And as my then CEO mentored me on, I was able to push myself into eventually running the clinical trials for the whole company, and was manager of clinical research before we got acquired by Medtronic. And then at Medtronic, I was pushed by my mentors to go get a sales experience, which would be very helpful on someday building and running companies. So I transitioned over a couple of years to train the physicians and the sales reps around the country on the technology, on how to treat patients with the catheter they bought, and then transitioned in the sales role for about 5 years at Medtronic, launching disruptive products like their first drug-coated coronary stent, which is now obviously commodity, but many years ago, it was an amazing innovation to keep arteries open for that long, and now it's commonplace, which is great. From there, I went to another startup company called Ardian, where we invented and developed a new technology to treat blood pressure using a device versus many, many medications, and much more successfully. That company was successful early on and got acquired by Medtronic again for about $1 billion back in 2000.
You can't get away.
Well, exactly. In fact, Medtronic can then invested in my next company, HeartFlow, which you may have heard of as well. It's a diagnostic for coronary artery disease, non-invasive and probably more accurate than most diagnostic tests. And another amazing disruptive technology that's been successful since I was there.
And did you found Renovo, or what stage was it when you joined?
So it was two people, essentially, back when I joined in 2014. Dr. Ram Tanaga, the inventor of the technology, co-founded the company in 2009. It was your typical Silicon Valley garage project, bootstrapped for the first several years before they got first funding in 2013. So I took over a year and a half into kind of it becoming, a corporate real company, albeit tiny. And they hired me as CEO once the previous CEO stepped down. So when I came in, they had just applied to the FDA for 510(k) clearance for the device, just filed their first patent, and now I've got about, I think, 19 issued internationally, and had never used this on a patient before, just finished the prototyping of the device. So it was definitely a very early stage company that I helped build out. So now they're being there for 11 and a half years and building a lot of progress and value, and now reaching many patients already. The founder affectionately calls me a mini founder. No, didn't found it, but I was there very creatively.
I'm sure. Well, right. It's founded, but when you join with an organization with two people, I feel like that counts, right? So in that, there must be a lot there, but I'm just curious. I mean, it sounds like you had a fairly, successful and stable career of joining these companies, going to Medtronic, leaving, going back to Medtronic, acquisitions, right? How did this come across your radar, and how did you decide that this was a good idea to go and be, person number 3 here versus leaving, what I can only assume was a fairly attractive and stable job?
It was a combination. So of seeing headwinds come into place at HeartFlow and having the opportunity here. So at HeartFlow, I joined them, I'd say, almost 15 years prematurely to commercialize them. The technology wasn't quite ready yet. They were just wrapping up a clinical trial that was unsuccessful, and they hired me to take them from clinical to sales, which is what my strong suit is. And when that happened, they said, "Look, you've got a lot of talent. You're an expert in clinical research," and they kept me on board. And I think they let my boss go at the time, who was really head of sales and marketing. So I became the global marketing or global director of market development. So I transitioned them from clinical research into commercial to some degree. So I ended up running their next major clinical trial like a salesperson would. The notion of let's get this enrolled as fast as possible, meet with the physicians face to face. I lived on an airplane. I spent most of my time Japan, Europe, and South Korea, I believe, at the time as well. And so I did two things. One was market development, and in parallel, drive the clinical trial to success. And then when we started wrapping up the trial, the data was looking very good. A lot of my efforts ended up resulting in what's now HeartFlow Japan. So I spent, I think it was in Japan maybe twice a month, met with the regulators there, the reimbursement specialists, built a consulting team, put together advisory boards of physicians. And at that time, we decided let's hire a local team in Japan. So it was time to turn focus back to the US when they were applying for FDA approval for the technology. And I saw the reimbursement headwinds would make it very difficult to get the product and the technology adopted anytime quick. It's now happened in the last few years. So I did see them almost stagnant for many years while building out Renovo. And roughly around the same time, Dr. Ramtin Nagata, founder of our technology, tapped me in the shoulder. And I've known him through two different companies previously, now for almost 30 years. And he said, look, this is a perfect sweet spot for you. It's clinical research transitioning to sales and market adoption. It's disruptive. It's challenging. This will change the face of cancer care. And this is ripe for you to take over and build this out as your first CEO opportunity. So it was perfect timing, both the company and the state it was, and for my career growth as well, to take this on about 11 and a half years ago.
And so you're really talking about a journey from an early prototype to phase 3 trial to commercialization. Was there a moment or maybe multiple moments that kind of felt like true turning points for the organization during that time period?
Yeah, I'm not sure how long this podcast is. I can talk about it for about 6 hours on true turning points of the company. But I'll highlight the top ones. It's been an amazing journey so far because I look back. Sometimes when I do investor updates or now that we're public, do kind of earnings calls and whatnot, I think about what we've accomplished in 3 months. And I could say every 3 months, we probably have one or two major turning points, and it never stops. It's been that way for 11 and a half years, which is why this is probably the most interesting job I've ever had in my career. But I think that the major reflections we've had is, and some of them were barriers and some were roadblocks. And that's part of my personality. And the fun for me is hitting those roadblocks and challenges and finding ways to overcome them. Early on, we believe strongly that if we change the way that chemotherapy is delivered by localizing it and reducing side effects and showing some benefit of efficacy, that should be enough to turn the minds of physicians to start using our technology in a space like pancreatic cancer where nothing is working. There's no better alternative than try something new. In fact, in the guidelines, as much as chemotherapy and radiation are first-line therapy in guidelines, it says in more than one place, first-line therapy should go to a clinical trial because they know that none of this stuff actually works. So with that, we hit a barrier because we did some early cases. We did a dose escalation safety study. We showed that the technology seemed to be safe, and we had some patients respond very well. So patients who would normally pass away after 6, 12, 15 months, our first patients lived 2.5, almost just over 3 years, some of them. So we saw this great technology. We actually tried to look at commercialization and do a post-market registry with some initial traction, but we couldn't get deep adoption with our first customers this is back in 2016, 17.
And what did you figure out why that was?
We did, and that's something I've always worked with physicians closely, and the oncologist said, look, there's nothing to tell me I should refer my patients to this. I shouldn't change my practice, what I learned in med school, what I learned in training, because sure, it looks promising, but there's not empirical head-to-head randomized data saying change this, which is true of most technologies for adoption.
Mm-hmm. So, and are they referring to guidelines or just studies that you could have your reps sharing with them? Are they looking for actual guidelines saying, hey, evidence-based medicine, go this direction?
It's honestly one and the same, especially in cancer, because it was the latter. It's the evidence-based medicine, show me clinical trials, and when you do that, that actually gets in the guidelines. So it's one and or the other, but they usually go hand in hand. And so with that, we designed a very robust, very lengthy, relatively expensive randomized clinical trial that we launched back in 2018, and we're wrapping up this year to demonstrate that evidence. And we did have an interim analysis with early data that showed that we're on the right track. So so we listened to the physicians, which has made this journey lengthy and challenging, but that barrier to adoption and success early has led us to be an extremely robust data-driven company, which is going to do the best by the patients to actually get this adopted at a deep level.
So let's, if you don't mind, we could spend a little time here because it sounds like this is really truly set the direction for kind of the last 5, 6, actually more, 8 years of your company. I always forget it's 2026 by now. But so when you say listening to physicians, right? This is something people often talk about, and one of the goals for this podcast is that people hear it and can kind of take something to their own organization, right? So when did that first surface? How did that surface? And then how did you, I'm sure there was a lot of exploration before you decided, yes, we're going to do this very long, very expensive clinical trial. Operationally, how did that all come about?
It started probably with one of our first advisors. So I'd inherited a small advisory board when I took over the company. Namely, there was a physician named Dr. Daniel von Hoff. Dr. Dan von Hoff, based in Arizona, I'd consider one of the godfathers of pancreatic cancer treatment. He was the principal investigator of Abraxane, or the current standard of care of the combination of gemcitabine plus Abraxane for pancreatic cancer. He was a PI for that study, got that approved, and that's still the standard of care. That was back in 2013. Previously, he was probably one of the leading investigators at all the work on gemcitabine, which is still the backbone and standard of care for many tumors, specifically in pancreatic cancer. So he was definitely the guy or the person and on our advisory board. And he was lukewarm on what we're doing. In fact, soon after I took over as CEO, he resigned from the advisory board. And I think part of it was because he was pushing us saying, look, you need a randomized trial. And we're a very tiny company, very minimally funded by family offices and more angel investors. And the board said, there's no way we're doing this. In fact, one of the board members said, over my dead body, will you do a large, expensive clinical trial? They were looking for a quick flip. It's like, here's a device, get the FDA clearance, show it works in patients, and sell this off to Medtronic, for a good return for the investors.
And move on to the next one for them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the next one. So so Dr. Dan von Hoff was pretty adamant that this is what you need to do, and he's the one who drives and pushes new therapies forward, especially in pancreatic cancer. So that's where it started, and then from there we did reach out to many oncologists. We went for the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, PanCan, as a big advocacy group. They were tied in a lot of physicians. We met through them, for example, Dr. Michael Pishvine, who they recommended, and we pulled in, who's been the principal investigator for our phase 3 TIGER-PaC study. So between Dan and Dr. von Hoff and Dr. Pishvine, we started to put our heads around what does a clinical trial look like, and pulled in more of the colleagues on the medical oncology side. So it was a couple physicians who allowed the beginning, and then we really did some research to see what's needed.
I'm always fascinated by this, because something of having an idea, but then in any organization, usually there's not just one person that can say yes, right? Like, you're the CEO, and even you can't pull the trigger yourself, right? You need to go and build consensus and get buy-in. So ultimately, we know there's no drama here. You ended up doing the trial. That same person who said over my dead body, were they still involved in that decision to go through, or had they moved on to other investments at that point off the board or whatever?
Yeah, that person was still involved and actually remained on our board for several years thereafter until he moved out of country back to his home country. So
how did you go about building consensus for this when you have such direct opposition?
Yeah, out of need, honestly. It was a necessity that this is the only way to make this company successful. It's going to be a longer time horizon. It will be more expensive. It will take more investments. It will take more dilution. But on the flip side, this is a much bigger story. So having that study been done, we have two choices. We close the company down and run out of money, or we decide to embark on a bigger mission with potential bigger return that's going to be pushed out later. And we've made a lot of decisions along the way where you have a choice. You have death or cliff, or you build something bigger and greater and better for patients and for medicine. So I'm very lucky that those are the two choices, because it becomes very obvious to me quickly, and then eventually I gain consensus.
That's amazing, right? So it is, but it is. I mean, even from an investor standpoint, it sounds like what you're talking about is trying to become the new standard of care, right? So that's a different level of, hopefully, impact and success and all of that. And then it's almost the need to force a decision of, are we going forward or are we not? And it sounds like there's some pretty real implications if the answer is no. That's really interesting. The other piece, so we haven't really talked about your technology much, but it's my understanding is that it's essentially like a hyper-localized drug delivery system, delivering the drugs directly onto the tumors themselves. Is that accurate, or am I off there?
No, you're spot on. And then specifically with our technology, we're focusing on tumors that don't have large blood supplies, which is the barrier to success in current therapies. If you look at liver cancer, for example, the tumors in liver cancers are really balls of blood vessels that are feeding these tumor cells. So you can easily reach them by giving systemic chemo. As much as you get side effects, it does reach there. In other tumors like pancreatic tumors, some non-small cell lung cancer, bile duct cancer, certain brain tumors, several others, they don't have a high level blood supply. And more specifically, they don't have very large blood vessels that feed them. So when you give systemic chemotherapy, it circulates the whole body but doesn't reach the tumor. We've developed and invented and patented a new mechanism where we push drug across the wall of the blood vessel to bathe the tumors in chemo locally. So it is, like you mentioned, dropping chemo almost right on top of the tumor and then saturating the tumor in chemo. And that's where we're seeing success and on not just reducing systemic levels, but also really driving high concentrations of drug at the tissue site.
I'm curious if this type of technology, even outside of oncology, is picking up speed elsewhere, because just like 2 weeks ago, I posted an episode with a guy actually in California. You should hang out with him. He's really a very cool guy. Similar story, 16-year journey of starting this company in the derm space, but almost the same mechanism of, I have a wound on my foot. I'm a diabetic patient. I have no blood flow down there. If I can deliver, medicines directly there, it gets no blood flow, right? It's similar, but obviously a different space, different. Is this a trend overall, like across medicine, or is this something that you're seeing a lot of these days?
It's interesting you asked about trend, because I feel like if and when it's successful, and we're starting to see the successes now, this will become more of a trend. I'm actually shocked that it hasn't been a trend. Especially if you look at things like chemotherapy. In fact, I remember talking to an advisor years ago, and they said, we'll look back like 50 years from now, it'll be less than that time, and think about how barbaric we were. How do you treat this ailment? Well, you blast the entire body with poison and hope some gets the tumors. No, not the way to go. So for whatever reason, we haven't really focused on this. And I think part of it for tumors like pancreatic cancer tumors is that there hasn't been a way to do it. There hasn't been a mechanism or development or a technology to do it. So we stumbled upon this, to some degree, but then really researched and figured out, okay, this is how you get drug there. So I do see that trending more. There's been a lot of focus on precision medicine, on targeting molecular pathways and or therapeutics to target specifically. But the problem is you still deliver those systemically. So there is a little bit more of a trend for local deliveries and technologies, but probably not enough.
Let's kind of continue this, right? Because you're talking about bringing this to market with a very science-first, evidence-based approach. In your career, as you alluded to earlier, you talked about a lot of cross-functional experience with clinical research, regulatory, sales, physician training, right? Because the med device guys are always in the surgery rooms, right? Operating with people. Do you think that that's helpful in developing messaging, developing marketing materials, a commercialization strategy for something that is actually a pretty innovative way to treat pancreatic cancer?
Absolutely. I strongly believe you've got to be on site with physicians to really understand what the market is. And that's the early part of my career that I'm lucky and glad my mentors pushed me towards. When they pushed me to go do sales to learn how to build technologies and build companies someday, now I truly understand is to understand what it takes to have a sales rep in an operating room and or a hospital convince a physician to change practice patterns. You got to know where the physician comes from. And you can't do that by reading a book or reading a brochure or reading or zooming in here and there. It really takes the hands-on, face-to-face learning. And that's one of the reasons why when we commercialized the device last year, the whole sales program was driven primarily by me and my head of strategy out in the field with physicians before we put a sales force in place. So really truly understanding what the market is. And given my background, I've done that so many times in my career. I know what it takes, but I've got to see it and touch it and feel it firsthand to know what the right pathway is sometimes.
And how many people do you have? How many people are in your sales force now?
So we're still small. So we put in place 3 reps last year and a head of marketing. We're going to add a couple more this year. And what I learned last year is you don't need a sales force of 10, 20, 30 people and burn a ton of capital and kind of eat up shareholder value there for the type of market that we're focusing on. Again, it's about doing things the right way and the efficient way that gets you the results.
Yeah, it's funny. Now I'm just going to talk about my personal problems here, but I have a very small sales and marketing team that I'm leading at my company. And when you talk about efficiency, sometimes things feel so inefficient setting up systems and doing things for a team of 5 people versus even 15 people would feel really different, where it's like, oh, am I just doing this for this one person? So how do you manage that, right? Like, you need systems, you need to operate to certain standards, but also when we are supporting such a small team, it can be sometimes easier, faster to just have direct one-on-one conversations with people.
It's challenging, and that's one thing I learned as a CEO that one of my mentors, who's actually the founder of my company, Dr. Ram Tegal, mentioned. I'm so used to being hands-on and so used to learning and directing and being communicative with the entire team. He told me a couple of years ago, he's like, be careful what you say to people aren't directly beneath you, because it carries a lot of weight when the CEO says something versus, for example, a manager says something. And I didn't realize that because I feel like we're all in the same team, we're all on the same battlefield. As much as I'm running the company, we roll our sleeves up, get down to the same levels. But when an executive says something to, let's say, an intern or like maybe a junior person or entry level person, as much as it's more efficient than going through a couple layers of management, it can come off a little bit stronger and a little bit scary sometimes and maybe not produce the right results. So it is a challenge to balance that.
Or you might even be talking out loud, right? Ideating, and they're taking that as direction, right? And you're
Yeah, absolutely.
accidentally, shifting trajectories without meaning to. That's really interesting. So let me ask, because you brought up the idea of relationships. Fully believe that is a great thing. I mean, honestly, that's why I do this podcast, is to make relationships. But in a world that's all AI, right? All the Super Bowl commercials for AI, right? Everything's AI and digital. What you're talking a lot about is the importance of face-to-face relationships with the doctors or with your colleagues. Do you think that approach can be an actual competitive advantage when you're thinking about healthcare leadership?
When you say advantage of using AI or not using AI?
Not the advantage of over indexing on face-to-face, right? Like, of actually creating meaningful relationships with people. In your case, a doctor is going to be like, yeah, I'm never going to prescribe that unless you show me the evidence, or I'm never going to use that unless you show me the evidence, right? That, to me, pre-COVID, I was always going to these pharma companies and meeting with them, and I feel like you'd have the meeting and it would go well or wouldn't go well, whatever. And then on the walk back to the elevator, when you're walking out of the door, that's when they would tell you what was really happening. And I think that is the hardest thing that is to replicate with digital, with AI.
100%, John. That's one of the reasons. Even during COVID, when we were shelter in place and on lockdown, I was still on a plane probably once a month. In fact, I remember flying to Belgium for one of our clinical trial procedures, and I had to get permission from the embassy, from the government. I had a letter from the CEO of the hospital, and I was probably one of 10 passengers on a jumbo jet flying across the ocean. It was weird. It was an empty city. The hotel was closed except for I think it's 4 or 5 rooms, and the restaurant was open for those 4 or 5 people there. And I've always valued that face to face, and that, because you're 100% correct. I've always gotten more things. You mentioned the elevator, because I've probably gotten more meetings done successfully on that elevator walk or the parking lot walk or the waiting in line for a coffee together when you meet for a coffee type situations where you really truly understand what's going on, what the potential pushback is or opportunities. And you can't get that on Zoom. I mean, this, for example, as much as this would be fun in person, it is efficient. And being a public company, for example, when we went public, I was able to handle, even in previous fundraisings, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 roadshow meetings in the course of 3 days, which used to be a lot of airplanes and taxis and shuttles that you have to do over several weeks. So there is a little of efficiency, but I try to balance that with jumping back on a plane and whenever there's an opportunity to go meet people face to face, so you get the best of both worlds.
Absolutely. Well, we will at some point when you're on the East Coast or I'm on the West Coast, we'll make it happen. And so let me just wrap up with one final question here, because I feel like it's something that you alluded to a couple of times, and but it's this idea of making a big jump, right? You talked about having a family that has a bunch of doctors in it, and then getting into medical school. I'm sure there are some pressures for you to then go and and do medical school, right? You talked about going from larger company acquired by Medtronic, right? Whatever headwinds are you're facing, that's still very different than a 2-person company. So if you had any words of advice for people that might find themselves in similar moments of should I take a leap, what would you say to them?
I'd say do it is my gut response, but that's my personality. And then my second response is it depends on the person, honestly. Some people are comfortable with these tough decisions and taking the path less traveled. And I've been lucky. It drives me. I get bored easily if I'm not challenged enough. And med school is one of them. I believe for the universities I chose, I picked the right fit that I thought would be a good balance on both success and learning and communication skills. And I picked the least ranked school that I got into for undergrad. I declined med school when I got there. I left the big company. My boss said, "Look, you're a senior sales rep at Medtronic, making a lot of money. People retire with this type of position. It's very coveted to have this. It takes a lot to get to a position like this, and you're taking a big risk by going to a startup company." But I wasn't passionate about not having an impact every day on medicine. And then even taking on this role 11 and a half years ago, I thought I wanted to learn more on the management side before I jumped into a CEO role. So I wanted to kind of build out my career more, but the opportunity was here and the potential impact on cancer was here. So I took that leap. So I've had several pathways. We went public in 2021 when I had previous people tell me never become a public company CEO. It's the worst, stressful, especially in the microcap space, headache job you could have. But it's afforded us the opportunity to survive and thrive in an environment where companies are closing down because they couldn't get funding. So I feel like I've taken so many paths less traveled. My advice to others are seek mentorship and guidance. I've had a lot of friends, family, and mentors I've built over the years to kind of use these sounding boards on this is the type of stuff I'm thinking about with this decision versus not. And eventually trust your gut. You come to the right decision. If you think about it, talk to people and see what aligns with your personality and what the best chance for success is.
I love it. All right. Well, let's leave it there. Shaun, thank you so much for joining me today.
Appreciate it, John. And great to catch up. Looking forward to that coffee or beer in person at some point.
Absolutely.
This episode of Pharma Sessions is sponsored by Xsunt, makers of the X1 reporting platform. And that's a wrap on today's episode of Pharma Sessions with me, Jonathan Kaskey. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe and share it with someone else in the pharma world who might need to hear it. For more on pharma trends, career growth, and business strategies, connect with me, Jonathan Kaskey, on LinkedIn. Until next time, thanks for listening.